They made me clean toilets at the most prestigious hospital in the city, never knowing I had once saved 200 lives in a single day. The head nurse would watch me scrub bathroom floors and shake her head like I was some kind of lost cause. Little did she know, I was anything but lost. My name is Sarah Chen, and I should have realized something was wrong the moment I walked into Metropolitan General Hospital for my first day and saw the way Director Williams looked at my resume. She held it between her thumb and forefinger like it might contaminate her manicured nails, scanning it with the kind of expression people reserve for expired milk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So you're the one they sent from the temp agency, she said, not looking up from the single sheet of paper that somehow failed to capture 23 years of my life. Previous experience in healthcare, it says here. I nodded, standing in her sterile office that smelled like industrial disinfectant and authority. The walls were covered with certificates and awards, all bearing her name in fancy script. Linda Williams, Director of Operations. Linda Williams, Excellence in Healthcare Management. Linda Williams, Community Leadership Award. I wondered if she had a certificate for making people feel small, because she certainly had a talent for it. Well, Sarah, she continued, finally setting my resume aside, like dismissed evidence, we'll see how that works out. The janitorial staff has been short-handed for weeks, and frankly, we need someone who isn't afraid of hard work. Janitorial staff. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I had applied for a position in patient care coordination, something that would actually utilize my background, but apparently the temp agency had other ideas. Or maybe Director Williams had other ideas. It was hard to tell which was worse. I understand, I said, keeping my voice steady. Whatever needs to be done. She stood up, smoothing down her perfectly pressed blazer, and walked around the desk to hand me a set of keys that jangled with the weight of disappointment. Margaret will show you around. She's been here 15 years, so pay attention to what she tells you. We have very high standards at Metropolitan General. Margaret turned out to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had seen everything twice. She met me in the supply closet that would apparently serve as my headquarters, surrounded by industrial mops, buckets, and enough cleaning chemicals to sanitize a small city. Don't let Williams get to you, she said quietly, handing me a uniform that consisted of navy blue scrubs with janitorial services embroidered across the chest pocket. She's like that with everyone new, especially the women. Thinks she has to prove something by being harder on us than the men get treated. I took the uniform and held it against myself, measuring it with my eyes. It would fit more or less. Everything in my life seemed to fit more or less these days. How long have you been doing this? I asked. 15 years next month, Margaret replied, organizing supplies with the efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted her circumstances. Started here right after my husband died. Needed steady work with benefits, and this place pays better than most. Plus, there's something to be said for honest work. Honest work. I turned the phrase over in my mind as I changed into the uniform in the small bathroom adjacent to the supply closet. The person staring back at me from the scratched mirror looked tired, older than her 38 years, wearing scrubs that marked her as invisible to most of the people she'd encountered during her shift. The face in the mirror had laugh lines around green eyes that had seen too much, dark hair that refused to stay completely neat, no matter how tightly I pulled it back, and hands that were steady, despite everything that had happened over the past 2 years. Those hands had once performed emergency surgery in a field hospital while mortar shells exploded 100 yards away. Now they would be gripping a mop handle. Margaret was waiting for me when I emerged, holding a clipboard thick with papers. First things first, you need to understand the hierarchy around here. Doctors are at the top, obviously. Then department heads, then nurses, then technicians, then administrative staff, then maintenance, and then us. We're the bottom of the food chain, Sarah, but that doesn't mean we're not important. She walked me through the hospital's layout, pointing out the different wings and departments with the practiced ease of someone who could navigate the maze of corridors blindfolded. Emergency department is always busy, lots of spills and messes. Surgical wing requires special protocols, everything has to be sterile. Pediatrics is actually my favorite, The kids are sweet, and the nurses there treat us like human beings. We stopped outside the emergency department, watching through glass doors as controlled chaos unfolded inside. Nurses moved with purposeful urgency, doctors consulted charts while walking at speeds that suggested life or death decisions, and patients waited in various states of distress and boredom. You'll mostly be working nights to start, Margaret continued. Fewer people around to get in your way, but also fewer people to help if something goes wrong. The night shift nurses can be territorial about their space, so don't take it personally if they act like you're intruding. As if summoned by her words, a nurse emerged from the emergency department, moving with the brisk confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. She had blonde hair pulled back in a high ponytail, and the kind of makeup that stayed perfect despite working 12-hour shifts. Her name tag read Jessica Martinez, RN, charge nurse. Margaret, she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, introducing another new recruit to the glamorous world of hospital maintenance. This is Sarah Chen, Margaret replied evenly. She'll be covering the night shift in your area. Jessica looked me up and down with the casual assessment of someone evaluating a new appliance. Well, Sarah, I hope you're more reliable than the last person they assigned to us. We had to call maintenance 3 times last week because someone couldn't figure out how to properly clean the trauma rooms. There was something in her tone that suggested this was less about cleanliness standards and more about establishing a pecking order. I had encountered this type of person before, in different uniforms and different circumstances, but the underlying dynamic was always the same. Someone insecure about their own position trying to secure it by diminishing others. I'll do my best to meet your expectations, I said, matching her professional tone without the underlying condescension. I'm sure you will, she replied, but her expression suggested she had serious doubts about that. Margaret, make sure she understands the protocols for the trauma rooms. We can't have any mistakes in there. After Jessica disappeared back into the emergency department, Margaret shook her head slightly. Don't mind her, she's actually a good nurse, just has some issues with authority and territory. Thinks because she's been here 5 years, she owns the place. We continued the tour, moving through different departments where I was introduced to other staff members with varying degrees of warmth and interest. Most people were polite but distant, offering quick nods or brief hellos before returning to their important work. A few were genuinely friendly, asking where I was from and how I was finding the job so far. Dr. Peterson in the pediatric wing actually stopped his chart review to shake my hand and welcome me to the hospital. We really appreciate what you folks do, he said, with the kind of sincerity that suggested he actually meant it. This place couldn't function without good maintenance staff. It was the first time all day that someone had spoken to me like I was a person rather than a problem to be managed or a service to be utilized. The doctors vary a lot, Margaret explained as we walked away from the pediatric wing. Some of them treat us like we're invisible, some are actively rude, and some, like Dr. Peterson, remember that we're all part of the same team. You learn to read people pretty quickly in this job. By the end of my first shift, I had learned the locations of supply closets on every floor, memorized the hospital's color-coded system for different types of waste disposal, and developed a mental map of which bathrooms were used most frequently and would require extra attention. I had also learned that Director Williams liked to make surprise inspections, that the overnight security guard, named Frank, had been here longer than anyone and knew where all the good vending machines were hidden, and that the emergency department generated more laundry in one night than some small hotels produced in a week. What I hadn't learned was how to reconcile the person I used to be with the person I was becoming. Standing in the employee parking lot at 6 in the morning, still wearing my janitorial uniform and smelling faintly of industrial cleaner, I looked back at the imposing brick facade of Metropolitan General Hospital. Somewhere inside those walls, people were making life and death decisions, performing miracles of modern medicine, and saving lives in ways both dramatic and routine. 2 years ago, I had been one of those people. 2 years ago, I was Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma surgeon with Doctors Without Borders, working in field hospitals in places most people couldn't find on a map. I had performed surgery by generator light while bombs fell outside, treated gunshot wounds with improvised equipment, and once worked for 36 straight hours during a cholera outbreak that threatened to overwhelm our small clinic. The day that changed everything started like any other day in the refugee camp outside Aleppo. We had been treating a steady stream of patients, mostly civilians caught in the crossfire of a conflict they had no part in starting. Children with shrapnel wounds, elderly people suffering from malnutrition and untreated diabetes, pregnant women who had walked for days to reach our clinic. I was in the middle of removing metal fragments from a 12-year-old boy's leg when we heard the planes approaching. The sound was distinctive, low and mechanical, growing louder until it seemed to fill the entire sky above our camp. "Airstrike," someone shouted, and suddenly everything became a choreographed chaos that we had practiced too many times to count. The wounded who could walk were helped to evacuation areas. Those who couldn't walk were carried on stretchers by whoever was available. Medical equipment that could be moved quickly was grabbed and relocated to predetermined safe zones. But there wasn't time to evacuate everyone. The first bomb hit the administrative building 200 yards from the medical compound. The sound was enormous, a physical force that seemed to push the air out of your lungs and replace it with dust and debris. Windows shattered throughout the camp, and the ground shook like an earthquake had struck. I had a choice to make. I could follow protocol and evacuate to the designated safe area, leaving behind the patients who were too critical to move. Or I could stay and do what I could to keep people alive while the world exploded around us. I stayed, for 6 hours, while bombs fell and buildings collapsed. I worked in an operating room that shook with each explosion. My hands never trembled as I sutured wounds and clamped arteries, even when ceiling tiles rained down around the surgical table and the backup generator failed twice. When the bombing finally stopped and rescue teams could reach us, they found me still working, still moving from patient to patient, still refusing to give up on anyone who might be saved. 203 people had been in the medical compound when the bombing started. 200 of them survived because someone stayed behind to treat their wounds, monitor their vital signs, and make sure they kept breathing when their bodies wanted to give up. 3 people died because even a trauma surgeon working alone in impossible conditions can't save everyone. The international news media called me a hero. They wrote articles about the doctor who stayed behind during an airstrike, who risked her own life to save others, who embodied the best of humanitarian medicine under the worst possible circumstances. The headlines were flattering. American doctor saves 200 lives during Syrian airstrike. Hero surgeon refuses to abandon patients. Medical miracle in war zone. What the headlines didn't mention was the cost of staying behind, the price of being a hero when the world is falling apart around you. They didn't mention the nightmares that started immediately afterward, dreams filled with the sound of falling bombs and the faces of patients I couldn't save. They didn't mention the way my hands would shake for no reason, or how I would wake up in a cold sweat thinking I could still hear planes approaching. They didn't mention that post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't care how many lives you saved or how many people call you a hero. It only cares that you experienced something traumatic, and it will follow you home regardless of how noble your reasons were for being there. I tried to return to normal life after that day. I completed my assignment with Doctors Without Borders, returned to the United States, and attempted to resume my career as a trauma surgeon in civilian hospitals. But normal life felt impossible when your nervous system was stuck in permanent fight-or-flight mode. The sound of helicopter rotors approaching the hospital would send me into panic attacks. Unexpected loud noises in the emergency room would cause my hands to shake so badly I couldn't hold surgical instruments. The final breaking point came during what should have been a routine surgery. I was removing an appendix, a procedure I had performed hundreds of times, when a piece of equipment malfunctioned and made a loud popping sound. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. Suddenly I was back in that field hospital, hearing bombs instead of medical equipment, feeling the ground shake beneath my feet. My hands began trembling so violently that I had to step away from the operating table and let another surgeon take over. That was the end of my career as Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma surgeon. The medical board was sympathetic but firm. A surgeon who couldn't control her physical reactions to unexpected sounds was a liability they couldn't accept. They recommended counseling, medication, and a leave of absence that everyone understood would probably be permanent. So I became Sarah Chen, former doctor, current patient, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life when the thing that defined you for 20 years was suddenly taken away. The therapy helped, slowly and incrementally. The medication helped too, taking the sharp edges off the panic attacks and allowing me to sleep for more than 3 hours at a time. But recovery from trauma isn't linear, and some days felt like starting over from the beginning. I moved across the country to start fresh somewhere that didn't have memories attached to every street corner. I found a small apartment in a city where nobody knew my story, where I could be anonymous while I figured out what came next. The temp agency job at Metropolitan General was supposed to be temporary, something to pay bills, while I decided whether to attempt returning to medicine or to choose an entirely different path forward. I hadn't expected to be assigned to janitorial work, but maybe that was exactly what I needed. Maybe I needed to start at the bottom and work my way back up to remembering who I was before trauma redefined me. Standing in that parking lot after my first shift, watching the sunrise paint the hospital windows gold, I made a promise to myself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I would do this job with the same dedication and precision that I had once brought to surgery. I would prove to myself that I was still capable of making a difference, even if that difference now came in the form of clean floors and sanitized bathrooms instead of saved lives and healed wounds. I had no idea that in a few short weeks I would be called upon to save lives again, or that the people who saw me as nothing more than the woman who cleaned their toilets would discover exactly who they had been underestimating all along. For now I was just Sarah Chen, night shift janitor, driving home to a quiet apartment where I could take off my uniform and try to remember what it felt like to be proud of the work I did. The next few nights fell into a predictable routine. I would arrive at the hospital at 11 p.m., check in with Margaret or whoever was supervising the night shift, collect my supplies, and begin the methodical process of cleaning and maintaining the areas assigned to me. The emergency department was always busy, a constant stream of patients with various degrees of medical crisis. Heart attacks, car accidents, drug overdoses, domestic violence injuries, children with mysterious fevers, elderly people who had fallen and couldn't get up. The full spectrum of human vulnerability played out in those rooms, while I mopped floors and emptied trash cans in the background. Most of the medical staff treated me exactly as Margaret had predicted they would, like a piece of necessary but unremarkable equipment. They would step around me while I cleaned, occasionally asking me to move my mop bucket or to come back later if they needed the space for a patient. A few were actively dismissive, sighing dramatically when they encountered my cleaning cart in a hallway, or speaking about me in third person while I was clearly within hearing distance. "Can someone please tell housekeeping that this area needs to be clear during shift changes, Doctor?" Morrison said loudly to a passing nurse while standing 3 feet away from where I was wiping down surfaces. He never looked directly at me or addressed me personally, as if direct communication with janitorial staff was beneath his professional dignity. Others were merely indifferent, acknowledging my existence only when absolutely necessary. "Excuse me," they would say, while squeezing past my cart, their voices polite but distant, the same tone they might use when asking someone to move aside on an elevator. But there were also moments of unexpected humanity that made the job bearable. Frank, the overnight security guard, turned out to be a former paramedic who had worked in emergency services for 30 years before retiring to the relative calm of hospital security. He would stop by wherever I was working around 2 a.m., usually carrying 2 cups of coffee from the good machine hidden on the 3rd floor. "Thought you might need some fuel," he would say, settling his considerable bulk into whatever chair was available and launching into stories about the early days of emergency medicine, when protocols were looser and technology was simpler, but somehow the work felt more personal. "These young doctors," he said one night, gesturing toward the emergency department where residents were running between patients with the frantic energy of people trying to prove themselves, "they're smart as hell, but they haven't learned yet that medicine is about more than just fixing problems. It's about seeing people." I sipped my coffee, which was surprisingly good, and watched the controlled chaos through the glass doors. "What do you mean?" "I mean they see symptoms instead of stories," Frank explained. "They see a heart attack instead of a man who's worried about who's going to take care of his wife if he doesn't make it. They see a car accident victim instead of a kid who was texting while driving and has to live with whatever consequences that choice brings." He was quiet for a moment, watching a young resident examine an elderly woman who had been brought in by ambulance. "The good ones learn eventually. The ones who last in this business figure out that every patient is somebody's whole world. I found myself thinking about his words long after our coffee break ended. During my years as a trauma surgeon, I had prided myself on seeing the whole person, not just the medical condition. But somewhere along the way, especially during the intense situations in field hospitals, it had become easier to focus on the immediate problem rather than the larger story. Maybe that was part of what had made that day in Aleppo so traumatic. I had been forced to see every patient not just as a medical case, but as a complete person with a family, a history, and a future that depended on decisions I made under impossible pressure. The pediatric wing turned out to be my favorite assignment, just as Margaret had predicted. The children's hospital occupied an entire floor, painted in cheerful colors with cartoon characters on the walls and volunteer readers who came in during the day to entertain patients. At night the wing was quieter but no less emotional. Sick children slept in beds surrounded by worried parents who had taken leave from work or arranged childcare for other children so they could maintain vigil beside hospital beds. The nurses in pediatrics were different too, more likely to treat janitorial staff as part of the team rather than as interruptions to their important work. "Sarah Wright," said a nurse named Amy during my second week, looking up from a chart she was reviewing at the nurses' station. "I wanted to thank you for how carefully you clean the play areas. I noticed you always wipe down all the toys and books, not just the obvious surfaces." It was the first time in weeks that someone had acknowledged not just that I existed, but that I was doing good work. "Children's immune systems are more vulnerable," I replied. It seemed important to be thorough. Amy nodded approvingly. "Exactly, some of our patients are undergoing chemotherapy or have other conditions that make them susceptible to infections. The extra attention to detail really matters." She paused, studying my face with the kind of careful attention that good nurses develop for reading people. "Have you worked in healthcare before? You seem to understand things that most maintenance staff need to be taught." The question caught me off guard. I had been careful not to mention my medical background, partly because it felt irrelevant to my current job, and partly because explaining why a former surgeon was now working as a janitor would require telling stories I wasn't ready to share. "Some experience," I said vaguely. "Different setting, but you learn to pay attention to things that matter." Amy seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to her charts, but I noticed that she began treating me more like a colleague than a service provider. She would warn me if certain rooms needed special attention due to infectious patients, and she started asking for my input on whether areas looked properly sanitized rather than simply expecting me to clean them. It was a small thing, but it made the work feel more meaningful. The real test of my place in the hospital hierarchy came during my third week, when Director Williams decided to conduct one of her surprise inspections during the night shift. I was cleaning bathrooms in the surgical wing when I heard her voice in the hallway, talking to someone about standards and accountability and the importance of maintaining the hospital's reputation for excellence. "The problem with temporary staff," she was saying as they approached the bathroom where I was working, "is that they don't have any investment in maintaining our standards. They're just here for a paycheck, not because they care about the quality of patient care." I continued scrubbing the sink, focusing on removing every trace of soap scum and water spots while trying to remain invisible. My plan was to finish quickly and move to another area before she entered the bathroom. But Director Williams had other ideas. "You," she said, stepping into the bathroom with her entourage of middle management followers. "Sarah, isn't it?" I straightened up, holding my cleaning cloth and trying to look professional despite being elbow deep in toilet bowl cleaner. "Yes, ma'am, I want to see your work," she announced, pulling out her phone and turning on the flashlight function. She began examining every surface I had cleaned, running her finger along the edges of mirrors and checking corners that most people would never think to inspect. Her followers watched this performance, with the uncomfortable expressions of people who recognized workplace bullying but weren't in a position to challenge it. "This mirror has streaks," she said, pointing to virtually invisible marks that might have been shadows from her flashlight. "And there's dust on this light fixture." I looked at the areas she was criticizing. The mirror was spotless by any reasonable standard, and the light fixture was cleaner than it had probably been in months. But I could see what was happening here. This wasn't about cleanliness standards. This was about establishing dominance and making sure I understood my place in the hierarchy. I'll take care of that right away, I said evenly. You'll take care of it now, she corrected. I don't have time to come back and check your work again. So I re-cleaned the mirror while Director Williams and her audience watched, using extra paper towels and making sure to polish every inch of the surface until it was perfect. I retrieved a stepladder and wiped down the light fixture, even though it meant disrupting my carefully planned schedule for the rest of the shift. Better, she said, when I finished, though her tone suggested it was barely adequate. Remember, Sarah, we have the highest standards in the region. Our patients and their families deserve nothing less than perfection. After she left with her entourage trailing behind, I stood alone in the bathroom holding my cleaning supplies and feeling something I hadn't experienced since my medical career ended. I felt angry. Not the helpless anger of someone being victimized, but the focused anger of someone who recognized injustice and was tired of accepting it passively. I had spent months in therapy learning to manage my emotional responses, to breathe through panic attacks, and to distinguish between real threats and perceived threats. But this wasn't anxiety or trauma response. This was simply anger at being treated poorly by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with. For the first time since starting work at Metropolitan General, I allowed myself to remember exactly who I used to be before trauma and circumstances forced me to reinvent my life. I used to be someone who saved lives. I used to be someone who made split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. I used to be someone who worked calmly under pressure that would break most people, who never let fear or uncertainty show when patients and families were depending on me to be strong. I used to be Dr. Sarah Chen, and maybe it was time to start remembering what that felt like. The humiliation escalated gradually, like water slowly coming to boil. What started as casual dismissal from Director Williams evolved into something more systematic, more intentional. She began scheduling her inspections to coincide with my shifts, always finding fault with work that exceeded any reasonable standard. It was Jessica Martinez, the emergency department charge nurse, who first turned my job into a performance for her entertainment. I was restocking supplies in the trauma bay when she walked in with two other nurses, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw me kneeling beside a cabinet, organizing medical supplies that weren't even part of my official duties. "Look who thinks she's a nurse now," Jessica said loudly enough for several people to hear. "Sarah, sweetie, those supplies are for medical professionals. Your job is mops and toilets, remember?" The other nurses giggled nervously, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge their charge nurse. I continued organizing the supplies methodically, making sure everything was properly labeled and easily accessible for the medical staff who would need them in emergencies. "I was just making sure everything was stocked correctly," I said without looking up. "Dr. Patel mentioned yesterday that they had trouble finding the specialized bandages during a trauma case. Dr. Patel mentioned it to you." Jessica's voice carried a note of disbelief, mixed with something sharper. Why would a doctor be discussing medical supplies with housekeeping? Because I had been restocking the trauma bay when Dr. Patel had been searching frantically for hemostatic bandages during a car accident case, and I had quietly pointed him toward the correct cabinet. Because I understood medical supply organization better than most people realized. Because despite wearing a janitorial uniform, I still thought like a doctor when I saw inefficient systems that could cost precious seconds during emergencies. But I couldn't say any of that without revealing more about my background than I was ready to discuss. "He just mentioned it in passing," I said instead. "I thought it would be helpful to make sure everything was easy to find." Jessica stepped closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume, mixed with the clinical scent of hand sanitizer that all hospital staff carried. "Let me explain something to you, Sarah. We have very specific protocols for medical supplies. Protocols that require medical training to understand. When housekeeping staff start rearranging things, it creates confusion and potentially dangerous situations." She gestured to the cabinet I had been organizing. "Move everything back exactly the way you found it. And in the future, stick to cleaning. That's what you're paid for." I wanted to point out that the way I had organized the supplies followed standard trauma bay protocols used in hospitals across the country. I wanted to mention that my arrangement would save critical seconds during emergency procedures. I wanted to explain that I wasn't just randomly moving things around, but applying 20 years of medical experience to improve efficiency. Instead, I silently moved everything back to its original, less logical arrangement and returned to mopping floors. But Jessica wasn't finished with her demonstration of authority. "You know what," she said, addressing her audience more than me. "I think our housekeeping friend needs a reminder about what her actual job responsibilities include." She walked over to the supply closet and retrieved a bottle of toilet bowl cleaner and a scrub brush. "The bathrooms in Trauma Bay 3 haven't been cleaned yet today. Why don't you take care of that right now, while we're here to make sure it's done properly?" The other nurses looked mortified. Even they could recognize that this crossed a line from professional correction into deliberate humiliation. But Jessica held her position as charge nurse, and challenging her openly would have consequences for their own careers. "I was planning to clean those bathrooms next," I said, accepting the cleaning supplies with as much dignity as I could maintain. "Perfect timing then," Jessica replied with false cheerfulness. "We'll just observe to make sure you understand our standards." So I cleaned a bathroom that was already reasonably clean, while 3 nurses watched like I was performing for their entertainment. I scrubbed the toilet bowl with extra attention to detail, wiped down every surface twice, and made sure the floor was spotless enough to eat from. The entire performance took 20 minutes that could have been spent on actual cleaning tasks, but the point wasn't efficiency. The point was establishing a hierarchy where I existed solely for their convenience and amusement. "Much better," Jessica announced when I finished. "See how well things go when everyone sticks to their proper role." Word of the bathroom incident spread quickly through the night shift staff. Some people seemed to find it amusing, whispering and pointing when I walked past their departments. Others appeared uncomfortable with the whole situation but unwilling to get involved in workplace drama that didn't directly affect them. Margaret found me later that night in the supply closet, sitting on an overturned bucket and staring at my hands.
These hands that had once performed emergency surgery were now holding a toilet brush, and somehow that felt like a metaphor for everything my life had become. "I heard what happened," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. Jessica was out of line. "She was establishing authority," I replied, surprised by how tired my own voice sounded. "Making sure I understood my place." "Your place is as a human being deserving basic respect," Margaret said firmly. "What she did was hazing, plain and simple, and it's not going to stop there." She was right, of course. Jessica had discovered that publicly humiliating me came without consequences, which meant she would continue escalating until someone stopped her or I found a different job. "Why don't you report her to HR?" Margaret asked. "They have policies about workplace harassment." I considered this suggestion seriously. In theory, human resources existed to protect employees from exactly this type of treatment. In practice, I was a temporary worker with no advocates, while Jessica was a permanent employee with 5 years of seniority and positive performance reviews. "What exactly would I report?" I asked. "That she asked me to clean a bathroom. That's literally my job description. That she made you clean a bathroom for her personal entertainment while she watched and mocked you," Margaret corrected. "That's harassment." But we both knew how that conversation would go. Jessica would claim she was simply ensuring quality control. Her witnesses would reluctantly support her version of events to protect their own positions. And I would be labeled as a troublemaker who couldn't handle reasonable supervision. The pattern continued and intensified over the following weeks. Jessica began requesting my presence in the emergency department whenever she wanted to demonstrate her authority to new staff or visiting administrators. She would find minor imperfections in my work and correct them publicly, using each incident as a teaching moment about standards and accountability. "This is what happens when people don't take pride in their work," she announced during one such performance, pointing to a water spot on a mirror that was virtually invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Attention to detail matters in a hospital environment. She started assigning me tasks that weren't part of my official duties, but fell into a gray area where she could claim they were necessary for patient safety. Cleaning behind medical equipment that hadn't been moved in months, scrubbing walls that were already spotless, organizing supply closets according to her personal preferences rather than hospital protocols. Other staff members began following her lead. Dr. Morrison, who had never spoken directly to me, started leaving messes for me to clean up with notes attached. Housekeeping, please address this spill ASAP. The spills were always minor, things that could have been cleaned up with a paper towel, but required my attention with a mop and official cleaning supplies. The radiological technicians started calling for housekeeping whenever they needed anything moved, even if it was just pushing a chair from one side of a room to the other. They would page me specifically, requesting Sarah from housekeeping for tasks that could have been accomplished in 30 seconds by whoever was already in the room. But the worst incidents involved Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a resident who had been at the hospital for 8 months and seemed determined to prove her authority by treating support staff like personal servants. I was cleaning the break room on the 4th floor when Dr. Thompson approached with a coffee cup in her hand and an expression that suggested I had personally inconvenienced her by existing in her vicinity. "Excuse me," she said, though her tone made it clear she wasn't actually requesting anything. "I need you to clean up something for me." She led me to her small office, where she pointed to her desk. There was a small coffee ring on the surface, the kind of minor stain that happens when someone sets down a mug without using a coaster. "This needs to be cleaned immediately," she announced. "I have important paperwork here, and I can't work in unsanitary conditions." The coffee ring was maybe 2 inches in diameter, barely visible on the dark wood surface. It would have taken her 30 seconds to wipe it up with a tissue. Instead, she stood there watching while I gathered cleaning supplies, moved her paperwork to a safe location, and thoroughly cleaned the entire desk surface. "Be very careful with those documents," she warned as I worked. "Some of them are confidential patient information. If anything gets damaged, it will be a serious problem." I cleaned around her paperwork with the same precision I had once used to suture delicate tissue, making sure nothing was disturbed or damaged. The coffee ring disappeared easily, and I returned her documents to their exact original positions. "Better," she said, examining my work like she was grading a school project. "In the future, try to be more prompt when medical staff requests assistance. We don't have time to wait around for housekeeping." She had paged me less than 5 minutes earlier, and I had responded immediately, but pointing that out would only create more problems. These incidents began happening multiple times per shift, each one carefully designed to reinforce the message that I existed solely to serve the convenience of people who wore different colored scrubs. The medical staff had discovered that requesting my services came without any oversight or time limits, which meant I became their personal cleaning lady whenever they didn't want to handle minor tasks themselves. The breaking point came during my 6th week at Metropolitan General, on a particularly busy Friday night, when the emergency department was overwhelmed with patients from a multi-car accident on the interstate. I was cleaning Trauma Bay 2 when the ambulances started arriving. The sound of sirens, the controlled urgency of medical teams preparing for mass casualties, the systematic efficiency of a hospital switching into emergency mode. All of it triggered memories I had been working hard to suppress. Suddenly, I wasn't mopping floors in Metropolitan General. I was back in that field hospital in Aleppo, hearing the approach of aircraft engines and feeling the ground shake with the impact of explosions. My hands began trembling, and I had to stop cleaning to focus on the breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth for 6 counts. Repeat until the panic subsides. I was making progress controlling the anxiety when Jessica's voice cut through my concentration like a knife. "Sarah, what are you doing just standing there? We have multiple trauma patients coming in, and this area needs to be spotless." I looked around Trauma Bay 2. It was already spotless. I had been cleaning it methodically for the past 20 minutes, and every surface was sanitized and ready for patients. "It's clean," I said, my voice slightly shaky from the adrenaline and anxiety coursing through my system. "It's not clean enough," Jessica snapped, gesturing broadly at the pristine room. "We're about to have critically injured patients in here. Everything needs to be perfect." She handed me a bottle of disinfectant and pointed to surfaces I had already cleaned twice. "Start over, do it right this time." I wanted to explain that I was having a panic attack triggered by the emergency situation. I wanted to point out that the room met every possible standard for cleanliness and sterility. I wanted to ask for 5 minutes to compose myself so I could continue doing my job effectively. Instead, I started cleaning the same surfaces for a third time while my hands shook and my breathing remained unsteady. That's when Dr. Thompson appeared in the doorway, surveying the scene with the expression of someone who had found an opportunity to demonstrate her importance. "Is there a problem here?" she asked Jessica, though both women were clearly looking at me. "Just making sure housekeeping understands the urgency of the situation," Jessica replied. "We can't have any shortcuts when lives are on the line." Dr. Thompson nodded sagely, as if this was a profound observation about medical priorities. "Absolutely. Sarah, I need you to understand something." She stepped closer, and I could see the authority she wore like armor, the way she used her medical degree as justification for treating other people as subordinates. "When we have mass casualties like this, every single detail matters. The difference between life and death can come down to whether someone did their job properly or took shortcuts because they thought it was good enough." I stopped cleaning and looked directly at her, feeling something shift inside my chest. She was lecturing me about life and death situations. She was explaining to me how details matter during medical emergencies. She was treating me like someone who had never experienced the pressure of saving lives under impossible circumstances. "I understand," I said quietly. "I don't think you do, Dr. Thompson continued, clearly enjoying her role as educator. "You're probably used to cleaning office buildings or retail spaces, where perfectionism isn't necessary. But this is a hospital. People's lives depend on the work you do here." Jessica was nodding approvingly, pleased that someone with actual medical credentials was reinforcing her authority over housekeeping staff. "When I worked in emergency medicine," Dr. Thompson said. And I almost laughed at the irony of her claiming expertise in emergency medicine when she was a resident who had probably never handled a true mass casualty event. "We learned that every team member has to perform at their highest level. There's no room for mediocrity." She gestured around the trauma bay that I had cleaned to surgical standards 3 separate times in the past hour. "So I need you to really think about whether you're giving us your best work. Because if you're not, and if someone gets hurt because of contamination or infection that could have been prevented, that's going to be on you." The ambulances were arriving outside, their sirens growing louder as they approached the emergency bay. Real patients with real injuries were about to enter this trauma room, and instead of preparing medical equipment or reviewing protocols, we were standing here discussing my cleaning technique. "Do you understand?" Dr. Thompson asked, waiting for my acknowledgement of her wisdom. I looked at her young face, earnest with the confidence of someone who had never been tested by genuine emergency conditions. I looked at Jessica, who had found a way to feel important by diminishing others. I looked at the trauma bay that was cleaner than most surgical suites. "I understand," I repeated. But what I understood was that I was tired of being lectured about medical emergencies by people who had never worked in a field hospital while bombs fell outside. I was tired of being treated like an incompetent child by individuals who had never faced the kind of pressure that strips away everything except your ability to save lives. I was tired of pretending that my 20 years of medical experience didn't matter because I was wearing the wrong colored scrubs. The first ambulance pulled up to the emergency bay doors, and through the windows I could see paramedics preparing to transfer a patient. Real medicine was about to happen, and I was standing in a perfectly clean trauma room, being lectured about cleanliness by people who had never cleaned anything more challenging than their own apartments. "Good, Dr. Thompson said, satisfied that she had properly educated the housekeeping staff about hospital priorities. "Now please finish up quickly and get out of our way. We have real work to do." Real work. As if maintaining the sterile environment where their real work happened wasn't also real work. As if ensuring that patients didn't develop secondary infections from contaminated surfaces wasn't also real work. I finished wiping down surfaces that were already spotless while the medical team prepared for their first patient. As I gathered my cleaning supplies and prepared to leave the trauma bay, I heard Dr. Thompson speaking to Jessica about proper supervision of support staff. "You have to stay on top of them," she was saying. "They don't have medical training, so they don't understand why precision matters. It's our responsibility to keep them accountable." I walked out of trauma bay, too, carrying my mop bucket and supplies, invisible to the medical professionals who were preparing to save lives. But as I moved through the corridors of Metropolitan General Hospital, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt angry enough to do something about it. For weeks I had accepted condescension and humiliation as the price of having a job that paid my bills while I figured out my next steps. I had told myself that temporary discomfort was acceptable if it helped me rebuild confidence in my ability to function in a medical environment. But there was a difference between accepting temporary discomfort and allowing people to systematically dehumanize you for their own entertainment. I had spent 2 years in therapy learning to distinguish between rational responses to current situations and trauma responses triggered by past experiences. What I was feeling now wasn't trauma response. It was rational anger at unjust treatment, and it was time to trust that my judgment about people and situations was still reliable.
The emergency department received 6 patients from the highway accident that night. 2 were critical, 3 were serious but stable, and 1 was minor injuries who would be treated and released within a few hours. I cleaned around the controlled chaos of emergency medicine, watching skilled professionals work together to save lives and treat injuries. It was beautiful to watch, the choreographed efficiency of a medical team operating at peak performance. It was also familiar in a way that made my chest ache with longing for the career I had lost. But as I watched the medical team work, I noticed something that the doctors and nurses were too busy to observe. They were making small mistakes, minor inefficiencies that came from working under pressure in an imperfect environment. Dr. Thompson spent precious seconds looking for specific instruments that weren't stored in logical locations. A nurse had to leave the patient's side to find supplies that should have been immediately accessible. The crash cart was positioned in a location that made it difficult to maneuver around the patient bed. These weren't life-threatening problems, but they were inefficiencies that could be easily corrected by someone who understood both emergency medicine and hospital logistics. Someone like me. For the first time since starting work at Metropolitan General, I allowed myself to really see the environment with a physician's eyes instead of a janitor's eyes. I noticed supply organization that didn't follow emergency medicine best practices. I saw equipment placement that created unnecessary obstacles during urgent procedures. I observed workflow patterns that could be optimized to save critical time during medical emergencies. I saw a dozen ways that my medical experience could improve patient care, if anyone had been interested in listening to suggestions from someone wearing housekeeping scrubs. Instead, I was valued solely for my ability to make toilets sparkle and remove coffee stains from doctors' desks. By the end of that shift, I had made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop hiding who I used to be. I was going to stop accepting treatment that no human being deserved, regardless of what job they performed. I was going to remind myself and everyone around me that experience and knowledge don't disappear just because trauma forces you to change careers. I didn't know yet how I would do it, or what consequences it might bring, but I knew that I was finished being invisible. The confrontation I had been building toward arrived on a Tuesday night in November, during what started as an ordinary shift that would end with everything changed forever. I was restocking paper towels in the emergency department restrooms when I heard commotion coming from Trauma Bay 1. Not the controlled urgency of a planned emergency response, but the chaotic sounds of something going wrong unexpectedly. "We need blood pressure support now," someone shouted, followed by the rapid beeping of medical monitors and the sound of equipment being moved quickly across linoleum floors. Through the partially open door, I could see medical staff rushing between different areas of the trauma bay. A patient had been brought in with what appeared to be routine chest pain, but something had deteriorated rapidly while they were being examined. Dr. Thompson was leading the response, her voice carrying the forced confidence of someone trying to project authority during a crisis she wasn't entirely prepared to handle. "Get me 2 large bore IVs and start pushing fluids. I need cardiac enzymes and a 12-lead EKG stat." I continued restocking paper towels, but my attention was focused on the medical situation developing 20 feet away. The patient's vital signs were deteriorating in a pattern that suggested something more serious than the heart attack they were initially treating. "Blood pressure's dropping fast," a nurse called out. "Down to 80/40 and falling." Increase the IV fluids and get me dopamine, Dr. Thompson ordered, but there was uncertainty in her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely sure what was causing the patient's decline. I finished restocking the bathroom supplies and moved closer to Trauma Bay 1, ostensibly to empty trash cans but actually to get a better view of what was happening. What I observed made my stomach clench with recognition. The patient was a middle-aged man who had initially presented with chest pain and shortness of breath. Standard protocol for possible heart attack which the medical team was following correctly. But his symptoms had evolved in a way that suggested a different diagnosis entirely. His blood pressure was dropping despite aggressive fluid resuscitation. His heart rate was increasing but his pulse was becoming weaker. Most significantly, his neck veins were distended, a sign that his heart wasn't effectively pumping blood despite the IV fluids they were pushing. This wasn't a heart attack, this was cardiac tamponade, a condition where fluid accumulates around the heart and prevents it from beating effectively. It's a medical emergency that requires immediate intervention, but it can be difficult to diagnose if you're not specifically looking for it. I had seen this condition several times during my years in emergency medicine, including twice in field hospitals where delayed recognition had been fatal. The treatment was straightforward but had to be performed quickly and correctly. Dr. Thompson, I heard a nurse say, his pressure's down to 70 systolic despite the dopamine drip. What do you want to do? There was a pause that lasted too long, the kind of silence that develops when the person in charge isn't sure what the next step should be. In that moment, I made a decision that would expose everything I had been hiding for months. I walked into Trauma Bay 1. "Excuse me, Dr. Thompson," I said, approaching the team of medical professionals who were focused on their deteriorating patient. "I think you might want to consider cardiac tamponade." The entire room went silent except for the continued beeping of monitors. Every person in the trauma bay turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Jessica Martinez was the first to find her voice. "What did you just say?" "I said you might want to consider cardiac tamponade," I repeated, looking directly at Dr. Thompson. The patient's presenting with Beck's triad, elevated jugular venous pressure, low arterial blood pressure and muffled heart sounds. The fluid resuscitation isn't helping because the problem isn't volume depletion. Dr. Thompson's face cycled through several expressions before settling on indignation. "I'm sorry, who are you to be offering medical opinions?" "Someone who recognizes cardiac tamponade when she sees it," I replied evenly. "You need to perform a pericardiocentesis immediately or this patient is going to die." The silence that followed was deafening. A janitor had just walked into a trauma bay and contradicted the attending physician's diagnosis in front of the entire medical team. "Security," Jessica said, reaching for the phone. "I'm calling security to remove you from this area immediately." But before she could complete the call, one of the nurses who had been monitoring the patient's vital signs looked up with alarm. "Doctor, he's going into cardiac arrest." The monitors erupted into the chaotic symphony of alarms that accompanies complete cardiovascular collapse. The patient's blood pressure disappeared entirely, and his heart rhythm deteriorated into an irregular pattern that indicated imminent death. "Start CPR," Dr. Thompson ordered, but there was panic in her voice now. She knew something was wrong with her diagnosis, but she wasn't sure what to do about it. I watched two nurses begin chest compressions while Dr. Thompson prepared to intubate the patient. They were following advanced cardiac life support protocols correctly, but they were treating the wrong problem. CPR wouldn't restore cardiac function if the heart was being compressed by fluid accumulation. "Thompson," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the alarms and activity, "you need to drain the pericardial space. The compressions won't work if the heart can't expand. Get her out of here now," Dr. Thompson shouted without looking away from her intubation attempt. But Frank, the security guard, had arrived and was standing in the doorway assessing the situation. He had been a paramedic for 30 years and he understood medical emergencies better than most people realized. "What's the patient's presentation?" he asked quietly. "Chest pain, hypotension, elevated JVP, and now cardiac arrest," I replied, grateful that someone was willing to listen. "Classic tamponade physiology." Frank nodded slowly. "How long since onset of arrest?" 2 minutes, a nurse replied while continuing chest compressions. Frank looked at Dr. Thompson, who was struggling with the intubation, then back at me.
What's your medical background? It was the question I had been avoiding for months, the inquiry that would require me to explain why someone with my experience was working as a janitor. But with a patient dying in front of us, my personal privacy seemed less important than saving a life. I'm a trauma surgeon, I said. 20 years emergency medicine, including extensive experience with cardiac tamponade. The room went silent again except for the mechanical sounds of CPR and medical monitors. Every person in the trauma bay was staring at me with expressions of shock and disbelief. That's impossible, Jessica said. You're housekeeping staff. I'm a trauma surgeon working as housekeeping staff, I corrected. And right now, I'm watching a patient die from a condition that I can treat if someone will let me. Thompson had successfully placed the endotracheal tube and was now manually ventilating the patient, but his condition wasn't improving. The CPR was maintaining some circulation, but his heart rhythm was becoming increasingly chaotic. This is insane, she said, looking around the room for support. I'm not going to let a janitor perform medical procedures on my patient. Then you perform the procedure, I replied. Get a long needle, 18 gauge or larger, and insert it into the pericardial space just below the xiphoid process. Aspirate the fluid that's compressing his heart. Doctor, Thompson stared at me like I had suggested something obscene. I'm not going to perform a blind pericardiocentesis based on the advice of someone who cleans toilets. 4 minutes since arrest, the nurse doing compressions announced. Still no pulse. I looked at the patient's face, pale and unconscious, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with having the knowledge to save someone's life. This was why I had become a doctor originally, for moments exactly like this when medical knowledge meant the difference between life and death. Let me do it, I said. The request hung in the air like an impossible proposition. A janitor asking to perform emergency surgery on a dying patient while the attending physician watched. Absolutely not, Dr. Thompson said immediately. I'm not going to risk a malpractice lawsuit because housekeeping staff wants to play doctor. 5 minutes, the nurse called out. We're approaching the point where continued resuscitation may not be viable. I looked around the trauma bay at the medical professionals who were trained and licensed to save lives but who were failing to recognize a treatable condition. The patient was dying because of diagnostic uncertainty and bureaucratic hesitation. I've performed this procedure dozens of times, I said, addressing everyone in the room. In field hospitals, in emergency departments, in conditions much more challenging than this. I can save this patient's life if someone will give me a needle in 30 seconds. Frank stepped forward, his security uniform giving him an authority that transcended the normal hospital hierarchy. Dr. Thompson, what's your experience with pericardiocentesis? Dr. Thompson's face flushed. I've observed the procedure during residency training. How many times have you performed it independently? Frank pressed. That's not relevant, she replied, but her tone suggested the answer was 0. 6 minutes, the nurse announced. We need to make a decision about continuing resuscitation efforts. Frank looked directly at Dr. Thompson. You have a patient dying from a condition you've never treated, and someone with extensive experience offering to help. What's your decision?
The weight of that moment settled over everyone in the trauma bay, a patient's life hanging in the balance, protocols being challenged, and hierarchies being questioned in real time. This is completely irregular, Dr. Thompson said, but uncertainty was replacing indignation in her voice. So is watching someone die from something you can fix, I replied. Jessica had been quiet during this exchange, but now she stepped forward with her authority as charge nurse. Even if she is a doctor, which I seriously doubt, she's not licensed to practice at this hospital. She's not covered by our malpractice insurance. This could destroy careers. And not treating cardiac tamponade destroys patients, I said, looking directly at her. Which consequence are you more comfortable living with? 7 minutes came the announcement from the nurse doing compressions. Neurological recovery becomes unlikely after 8 minutes of arrest. Dr. Thompson was staring at the patient's monitor, watching heart rhythms that weren't responding to standard resuscitation protocols. She knew something was wrong with her approach, but admitting it meant acknowledging that a janitor had made the correct diagnosis when she had missed it. I need to see some identification, she said finally. If you're really a doctor, prove it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet,
extracting a medical license that I had kept current, despite no longer practicing. Dr. Sarah Chen, Maryland, licensed to practice emergency medicine and trauma surgery. Frank examined the license and nodded. It's current and valid. That doesn't mean she's qualified to perform procedures at this hospital, Jessica insisted. 8 minutes, the nurse called out. This is the maximum recommended duration for resuscitation efforts. I looked at the patient's face one more time, then made a decision that would change everything for everyone in that room. Dr. Thompson, I said, if you don't let me try to save this patient, he's going to die. If you do let me try and something goes wrong, you can blame it on the crazy janitor who claimed to be a doctor. But if I succeed, you'll have learned something about cardiac tamponade that might save the next patient. The monitors continued their chaotic symphony of alarms, while everyone in the trauma bay considered the impossible situation we had created. Fine, Dr. Thompson said finally, her voice barely audible over the medical equipment. But I'm documenting everything. This is your responsibility. I stepped forward to the patient's bedside, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like myself again. The familiar weight of medical responsibility, the clarity that comes with having specific knowledge needed to solve a specific problem, the focus that eliminates everything except the task at hand. I need an 18-gauge spinal needle, a 20-milliliter syringe, and betadine solution, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders during medical emergencies. The nurses hesitated, looking to Dr. Thompson for confirmation. Get her what she needs, she said quietly. As the supplies were being gathered, I explained the procedure to everyone watching. Pericardiocentesis involves inserting a needle into the pericardial space to drain fluid that's compressing the heart. The needle goes in just below the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder. The key is feeling for the characteristic change in resistance when you enter the pericardial space. The nurse handed me the sterile needle and syringe. I quickly prepped the patient's chest with betadine, located the correct anatomical landmarks, and positioned the needle for insertion. If this works, I said, looking up at Dr. Thompson, his blood pressure should improve immediately, and his heart rhythm should stabilize. And if it doesn't work, she asked. Then you can document that the janitor killed your patient with an unnecessary procedure, I replied. But it will work. I inserted the needle slowly, feeling for the subtle changes in tissue resistance that would indicate proper placement. 20 years of emergency medicine had taught me to trust my hands as much as my eyes when performing procedures. There, I felt the needle enter the pericardial space and immediately began aspirating with the syringe. Dark red fluid filled the syringe almost instantly, confirming the diagnosis of cardiac tamponade. As I withdrew the fluid that had been compressing the patient's heart, his vital signs began improving immediately. Blood pressure rising, a nurse announced with amazement, 80/50 and climbing. Heart rhythm stabilizing, another nurse called out, converting back to normal sinus rhythm. I withdrew 60 milliliters of fluid from the pericardial space, and with each milliliter removed, the patient's condition improved dramatically. His blood pressure normalized, his heart rhythm became regular, and his pulse became strong and palpable. Stop CPR, I said. Check for spontaneous pulse and respirations. The nurse stopped chest compressions and immediately felt a strong pulse at the patient's wrist. Pulse present and regular. Blood pressure 120/80. Within 2 minutes of the procedure, the patient's vital signs had completely normalized. The monitors stopped alarming. The chaotic medical emergency became calm and controlled, and everyone in the trauma bay was staring at me with expressions of shock and disbelief. I had just saved a patient's life while wearing a janitor's uniform. That was incredible, one of the nurses whispered. Dr. Thompson was staring at the patient's monitor like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. How did you know? Because I've seen it before, I replied, disposing of the needle and syringe in the appropriate medical waste container. Multiple times. Cardiac tamponade has a very specific presentation if you know what to look for. The patient was beginning to wake up as the sedation medications wore off and his brain received adequate oxygen again. He would make a complete recovery with no neurological damage, because the procedure had been performed before permanent harm occurred. Why didn't I recognize it? Dr. Thompson asked, and for the first time since I had met her, Her voice carried genuine humility instead of defensive arrogance. Because medical school teaches you to look for common presentations of common problems, I explained. Chest pain in a middle-aged man equals heart attack until proven otherwise. But sometimes uncommon presentations of uncommon problems look similar to common presentations of common problems. Jessica had been completely silent during the procedure, but now she stepped forward with an expression that combined awe with something that looked like fear. "You really are a doctor," she said quietly. "I really am," I confirmed. Frank was shaking his head slowly, processing everything he had witnessed. "So why are you working as a janitor?" It was the question everyone was thinking but afraid to ask. Why would someone with the knowledge and skill to save lives choose to clean toilets instead? "That's a long story," I said. "But the short version is that trauma changes people, sometimes in ways that make it difficult to continue doing the work you used to do." Dr. Thompson was staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "What kind of trauma?" I looked around the trauma bay at the medical professionals who had just watched me save a patient's life. They deserved an explanation, especially after what they had witnessed. "I worked for Doctors Without Borders in Syria. During an airstrike on a refugee camp, I stayed behind to treat patients who couldn't be evacuated. I saved 200 lives that day, but the experience gave me PTSD that ended my surgical career." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This wasn't shock or disbelief. This was respect mixed with understanding. "The doctor who saved 200 lives in Syria," Frank said slowly. "I remember reading about that. You're that doctor." "I'm that doctor," I confirmed. "Working as a janitor because my hands shake too badly to perform surgery when I hear unexpected loud noises. But apparently I can still diagnose cardiac tamponade and perform emergency procedures when someone's life depends on it." The patient was fully conscious now, looking around the trauma bay with confusion but grateful to be alive. He would need additional treatment and monitoring, but the immediate crisis had passed. "Thank you," Dr. Thompson said, and her voice carried genuine gratitude. "You saved his life." "We all did," I replied. "I just happened to recognize a condition that others missed." That's how medicine works when it works properly. But even as I said it, I knew that everything had changed in that trauma bay. I had revealed who I really was, and there would be consequences for everyone involved. I had stopped being invisible, and now everyone would see me clearly for the first time. The aftermath of saving a patient's life while wearing a janitor's uniform created ripples that spread through Metropolitan General Hospital like shockwaves from an earthquake. Within an hour of the cardiac tamponade incident, Director Williams was standing in Trauma Bay 1 with her arms crossed, and her face displaying the kind of controlled fury that suggested someone was about to face serious consequences. "Dr. Chen," she said, emphasizing my title with the precision of someone loading bullets into a weapon, "I need to see you in my office immediately." The patient had been stabilized and transferred to the cardiac intensive care unit, where he would make a complete recovery thanks to the emergency intervention. Dr. Thompson had completed all the necessary documentation, carefully noting that an off-duty physician had assisted with the procedure. Frank had provided a security report that corroborated the medical emergency and the unconventional response. But none of that mattered to Director Williams, who saw only a massive violation of hospital protocols and potential liability issues that could threaten her carefully managed administrative empire. I followed her through the corridors of the hospital, still wearing my janitorial uniform, but walking with a different posture than I had carried for months. The secret was out, and with it came a freedom I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I no longer had to pretend to be less than I was. Her office felt different this time, smaller somehow, as if the authority it represented had diminished once I stopped accepting it as absolute. The certificates on her walls still proclaimed her various achievements in healthcare management, but they seemed less impressive when viewed by someone who had actually saved lives under combat conditions. "Sit down," she commanded, taking her position behind her desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. I remained standing. "I prefer to stand, thank you." Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. In all our previous interactions, I had been deferential, accepting her authority without question. But the person who had just performed emergency surgery wasn't the same person who had quietly endured months of systematic humiliation. Dr. Chen, she began again, consulting a folder that I assumed contained my employment records. I've just learned that you've been working at this hospital under false pretenses for nearly 2 months. I've been working at this hospital under the employment arrangement established by your temp agency, I corrected. Nothing about that arrangement was false. You failed to disclose that you're a licensed physician, she continued, ignoring my correction. That's a significant omission that could have serious legal implications. I considered this accusation carefully. When I applied for janitorial work through the temp agency, was I asked about medical licenses or previous healthcare experience? She consulted her paperwork, scanning through what appeared to be my original application materials. That's not the point. Actually, that's exactly the point, I replied. I was hired to perform custodial services, which I've done to the highest standards for 2 months. My medical background wasn't relevant to the position I was hired to fill. It became relevant the moment you performed an unauthorized medical procedure on a patient, she shot back. I performed a life-saving medical procedure on a dying patient at the request of the attending physician, I corrected. Everything was properly documented and witnessed by multiple medical professionals.
Director Williams leaned back in her chair, studying me with new eyes. She was beginning to realize that the compliant janitor she thought she was disciplining had been replaced by someone who understood hospital administration, medical law, and professional protocols better than she had anticipated. Thompson has submitted a report stating that she requested your assistance during a medical emergency, she admitted reluctantly, but that doesn't change the fact that you've been deceptive about your qualifications. I haven't been deceptive about anything, I said firmly. I've been private about personal information that wasn't relevant to my employment. There's a significant difference. She opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be printouts from internet searches. Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma surgeon with Doctors Without Borders. The doctor who saved 200 lives during an airstrike in Syria. Multiple news articles, interviews, awards for humanitarian service. I waited while she reviewed my biography, as presented by international media outlets that had covered the refugee camp incident. Why is someone with your background working as a janitor? She asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than administrative irritation. Because trauma changes people, I said simply. Because heroic actions can have consequences that make it difficult to continue the work that made you a hero in the first place. I sat down in the chair across from her desk, not because she had commanded it but because I chose to. Because sometimes you need to start over at the bottom to remember who you are before you can figure out who you're going to become. Director Williams was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. I could see her mental calculations as she considered the liability issues, publicity implications, and administrative complications of having an internationally recognized trauma surgeon working in her hospital's custodial department. Dr. Chen, she said finally, I think we need to discuss your future employment arrangements. Over the next hour, we negotiated what would amount to a complete transformation of my role at Metropolitan General Hospital. The conversation was unlike any discussion I'd had during my months as a janitor, conducted between two professionals who understood healthcare administration and medical practice. Director Williams, despite her earlier hostility, proved to be a pragmatic administrator who recognized an opportunity when she saw one. Having a trauma surgeon with international recognition on staff, even in an unconventional capacity, could provide significant benefits for the hospital's reputation and emergency capabilities. We can't simply transfer you from janitorial to medical staff, she explained. There are credentialing processes, board certifications to verify, insurance considerations to address, but we can create a consulting position that allows you to provide medical expertise, while we work through the administrative requirements. The proposal she outlined was more generous than I had expected. A medical consulting role that would allow me to work with the emergency department on difficult cases, provide training for residents and nurses, and serve as an additional resource during mass casualty events. The salary was significantly higher than my custodial wages, and the position came with the respect and recognition that my medical background deserved. But there was one condition that gave me pause. I need to know that this isn't going to be a publicity stunt, I said. I don't want to be the hospital's poster child for humanitarian medicine or the inspiring story about overcoming trauma. I just want to practice medicine again. Director Williams nodded understanding.
We can be discreet about your background until you're comfortable with more visibility. The goal is to utilize your expertise, not exploit your story. The arrangement we reached felt like a form of redemption, a chance to return to meaningful medical work without the intense pressure that had triggered my PTSD symptoms. I would start slowly, consulting on selected cases and providing educational support, with the possibility of returning to full medical practice if my recovery continued progressing. But the real transformation wasn't happening in Director Williams' office. It was happening throughout the hospital as word spread about the janitor who turned out to be a world-renowned trauma surgeon. The news traveled through the medical staff with the speed that gossip achieves in closed professional communities. By the end of my shift, every department knew that the woman they had been treating as invisible help was actually Dr. Sarah Chen, the physician who had made international headlines for her heroic actions in Syria. Dr. Thompson sought me out as I was preparing to leave for the evening, her face showing a mixture of embarrassment and professional curiosity. "Dr. Chen," she said, using my title with genuine respect for the first time, "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you. I had no idea about your background, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. You treated me the way hospital hierarchy typically treats custodial staff," I replied. "The problem wasn't personal prejudice against me specifically. The problem was systemic prejudice against an entire category of workers." She considered this observation carefully. "You're right, I've been thinking about that since this afternoon. How many other people have I dismissed or talked down to because of their job title rather than their individual worth?" It was a question that more medical professionals needed to ask themselves, but hearing it from Dr. Thompson suggested that the events of the day had created learning opportunities beyond just cardiac tamponade diagnosis. "What I don't understand," she continued, "is how you maintained your composure during all the disrespectful treatment you received. If someone had talked to me the way I talked to you, I would have been furious." I was furious, I admitted, but I was also rebuilding my confidence in my ability to function in medical environments. Sometimes you have to accept temporary discomfort to achieve longer-term goals. Dr. Thompson shook her head. "The way Jessica treated you was completely unacceptable, making you clean bathrooms for entertainment, lecturing you about medical priorities. She must be mortified now that she knows who you really are." Actually, Jessica's response to the revelation had been notably absent. While other staff members had approached me with apologies or questions about my background, she had disappeared from the emergency department shortly after the cardiac tamponade incident and hadn't been seen since. "People respond to embarrassment in different ways," I said diplomatically. "Some people apologize and learn from their mistakes. Others double down on their original position to avoid admitting they were wrong." The next few days brought a parade of staff members wanting to speak with me, each with their own motivations and reactions to learning about my real identity. Some were genuinely apologetic, like the radiological technicians who had summoned me for trivial tasks and the administrative staff who had treated me like their personal cleaning service. They approached with sincere embarrassment and requests to start over with proper respect. Others were clearly motivated by self-interest, suddenly remembering that they had always been kind to me and hoping to be associated with someone who had achieved international recognition in medicine. These conversations were more challenging to navigate, requiring diplomacy to accept their retroactive friendship without endorsing their selective memory. But the most difficult conversations came from medical staff who seemed angry about the deception, as if my failure to announce my credentials had somehow tricked them into revealing their true characters. Dr. Morrison, who had never spoken directly to me during my months as a janitor, cornered me near the elevator bank on my third day as a medical consultant. "Chen," he said, his voice carrying the accusatory tone of someone who felt he had been made to look foolish, "I think what you did was highly unethical." "Which part specifically?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "Letting people treat you poorly when you could have corrected their behavior at any time," he said. "You allowed situations to develop that made the medical staff look bad, when you could have prevented them by simply being honest about your qualifications." I considered his argument, which seemed to place responsibility for other people's behavior on my failure to provide information that would have prevented them from behaving badly. "Morrison," I said carefully, "are you suggesting that people should only treat janitors with respect if they might secretly be doctors?" "That's not what I'm saying," he replied, though his face suggested he was beginning to realize the implications of his position. Because it sounds like you're arguing that my failure to reveal my medical credentials somehow justified disrespectful treatment of someone you believe to be custodial staff, I continued. Which would suggest that custodial staff deserve disrespectful treatment unless they prove otherwise. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it as he recognized the logical trap his reasoning had created. If my deception was unethical because it allowed people to treat me poorly, then the underlying assumption was that treating custodial staff poorly was acceptable behavior that I had unfairly enabled. I need to think about this more, he said finally, walking away with an expression that suggested he was uncomfortable with the conclusions his own logic had reached. These conversations were exhausting but necessary, forcing the medical staff to confront their own assumptions about professional hierarchies and the respect owed to different categories of workers. Margaret, my supervisor from the custodial department, had perhaps the most interesting perspective on the entire situation. "I'm happy for you," she said, during a coffee break we shared in the supply closet that had been my headquarters for months. "But I'm also worried about what this means for the rest of us." "What do you mean?" I asked. "You turned out to be special," she explained. "You had credentials and achievements that made people reconsider how they treated you. But the other custodial staff are still just custodial staff. Are they going to be treated better because of what happened with you, or are they going to be treated worse because they're not secretly doctors?" It was a perceptive question that highlighted the broader implications of my situation. Individual success stories could sometimes improve conditions for entire groups, but they could also create unrealistic expectations or resentment that made things worse for others. "I think," I said slowly, "that the best thing I can do is make sure that my new position includes advocating for respectful treatment of all hospital staff, regardless of their job titles or educational backgrounds." Margaret smiled. "That would be good. Because most of us really are just custodial staff, and we deserve to be treated with dignity too." The most significant change in my daily experience came from Frank, the security guard who had been my only real friend during the months of invisibility. "You know what's funny," he said, during one of our late-night coffee breaks, which continued despite my change in status. "I always knew you were different, not because of anything specific you said or did, but because of how you moved through the hospital." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Most people who work nights in hospitals are either trying to avoid something or trying to get somewhere else," he explained. "But you moved like someone who belonged in medical environments, even when you were mopping floors. I figured you'd been a nurse or maybe a technician before this job." Frank had been treating me with respect and kindness when everyone else saw me as invisible, and that hadn't changed with the revelation of my medical background. If anything, he seemed pleased that his instincts about my character had been validated. Plus, he added with a grin, "Now I can say I was friends with a famous doctor before anyone else figured out who she was." The most challenging aspect of my transition from custodial to medical staff was managing my own psychological adjustment to being visible again. For months I had moved through the hospital unnoticed, observing medical practice without participating in it. Suddenly I was being consulted on difficult cases, asked for my opinions on treatment protocols, and included in medical discussions as an equal colleague. The change was both welcome and overwhelming. I had forgotten what it felt like to have my medical knowledge valued and respected. I had grown accustomed to being dismissed and ignored, and breaking those patterns required conscious effort. During my first week as a medical consultant, I was asked to review a case involving a patient with multiple trauma injuries from a motorcycle accident. The attending physician, Dr. Rodriguez, had requested my consultation because the patient's condition wasn't responding to standard trauma protocols. "Chen," he said, showing me the patient's chart and diagnostic images, "we've been treating this patient for internal bleeding, but the blood loss doesn't match what we're finding surgically. I'm wondering if we're missing something." I reviewed the case materials carefully, applying the systematic approach to trauma diagnosis that I had developed during years of emergency medicine. The patient had multiple injuries, but the pattern suggested something beyond simple internal bleeding. "Has anyone considered fat embolism syndrome?" I asked after studying the lab results and imaging studies. Dr. Rodriguez paused, considering the possibility. "The patient does have long bone fractures that could release fat globules into circulation. What makes you think that's the diagnosis?" I pointed to specific findings in the patient's presentation that suggested fat emboli rather than continued bleeding. "The respiratory symptoms, the neurological changes, and the petechial rash all point toward fat embolism. The blood loss you're seeing might be related to the clotting disorders that develop with this condition rather than mechanical bleeding from trauma. We spent the next hour discussing the diagnosis and treatment options for fat embolism syndrome, a relatively rare complication of trauma that required specific interventions. Dr. Rodriguez implemented the treatment plan I suggested, and the patient's condition began improving within hours. "Thank you," Dr. Rodriguez said after we confirmed that the patient was responding to treatment. "I've never seen a case of fat embolism syndrome before. How many have you treated?" "Dozens," I replied. "It's more common in field hospitals where you see high-energy trauma without immediate access to advanced surgical facilities. You learn to recognize conditions that might not be covered extensively in standard residency training."
These consultations reminded me why I had become a doctor originally, and why I had chosen emergency medicine specifically. The intellectual challenge of solving complex diagnostic puzzles, the satisfaction of applying specialized knowledge to save lives, the collaborative nature of medical practice at its best. But they also triggered occasional anxiety responses that reminded me why I had needed to step away from medicine in the first place. When trauma bay alarms went off unexpectedly, my hands would still shake slightly. When helicopter ambulances approached the hospital, I would still feel my heart rate increase and my breathing become shallow. The difference was that now I had colleagues who knew about my PTSD and understood why certain situations might be triggering. Dr. Thompson had read about my experiences in Syria and made sure that other medical staff were aware of my history and supportive of my recovery process. "Chen," she said during one of our consultations, "if you ever need to step away from a case because of anxiety or trauma responses, just let me know. We can handle things until you're ready to return." It was exactly the kind of understanding and accommodation that had been missing during my previous attempts to return to medical practice. Having colleagues who acknowledged my trauma history without treating it as a weakness made it possible to work through difficult moments instead of being overwhelmed by them. The most unexpected consequence of my revelation was the attention it brought from outside the hospital. News outlets that had covered my story in Syria began calling for interviews about my current work. Medical journals requested articles about trauma recovery and returning to practice after PTSD. Humanitarian organizations wanted me to speak at conferences about the long-term effects of working in conflict zones. Director Williams had been fielding these requests and presenting them to me for consideration. "You're under no obligation to do any publicity," she reminded me. "But some of these opportunities might be valuable for raising awareness about physician mental health and trauma recovery." I was tempted by some of the speaking opportunities, particularly those focused on helping other medical professionals who had experienced trauma. But I was also protective of the healing space I had created at Metropolitan General, where I could practice medicine without the pressure of public attention. "I think I'd like to focus on establishing myself here before taking on external commitments," I said. "Maybe in a few months when I'm more confident about my ability to handle the emotional demands of medical practice." Director Williams nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a wise approach. The opportunities will still be there when you're ready for them." The most important validation of my decision to reveal my identity came from the patient whose life I had saved during the cardiac tamponade incident. Mr. Thompson, no relation to Dr. Thompson, had made a complete recovery and was being discharged from the hospital. He had requested to meet with me before leaving, wanting to thank the doctor who had saved his life during what he described as the most terrifying experience of his existence. "Dr. Chen," he said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone grateful to be alive, "I understand that you went out on a limb to help me. That you weren't even supposed to be providing medical care. I was in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge," I replied. "Any doctor with trauma experience would have done the same thing." "But you weren't just any doctor," he said. "You were someone who had been treated poorly by the same people who watched you save my life. You could have stayed silent and let them handle things their way. But you didn't." He was right, of course. I could have remained invisible, let the medical team continue with their unsuccessful resuscitation efforts, and avoided the complications that came with revealing my identity. But watching someone die from a treatable condition when I had the knowledge to save them would have been its own form of trauma. "Mr. Thompson," I said, "saving your life reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to remember who I am."
As I watched him leave the hospital with his family, walking out under his own power because of medical intervention that had happened at exactly the right moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. I felt proud of being a doctor again. The person who had started working at Metropolitan General as an invisible janitor no longer existed. In her place was Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma surgeon and medical consultant, someone who had learned that identity isn't determined by job titles or other people's perceptions, but by your own understanding of who you are and what you're capable of achieving. The woman who cleaned toilets had saved a man's life, and in doing so, had saved her own. 6 months after the cardiac tamponade incident that changed everything, I stood in the same trauma bay where I had first revealed my identity, but this time wearing scrubs that bore the embroidered title, Dr. Sarah Chen, Emergency Medicine Consultant. The transformation felt complete in ways I hadn't anticipated when I first picked up that mop and bucket. Metropolitan General Hospital had become not just my workplace, but a place where I had rediscovered who I was beneath the trauma and setbacks that had temporarily derailed my career. My official role as medical consultant had evolved into something more comprehensive than anyone had initially imagined. I provided expertise on complex trauma cases, trained residents in advanced emergency procedures, and served as a bridge between different departments when challenging cases required interdisciplinary coordination. But perhaps most importantly, I had become an advocate for respectful treatment of all hospital staff, regardless of their position in the administrative hierarchy. The monthly staff meetings I now facilitated brought together people from every department to discuss patient care improvements and workplace culture. Nurses, technicians, custodial staff, administrators, and physicians sat at the same table as equals, contributing perspectives that had previously been ignored or dismissed. Margaret attended these meetings as a representative of the custodial department, and her insights about hospital operations often proved more valuable than those offered by people with advanced degrees and impressive titles. When you're invisible, she explained during one particularly productive discussion about infection control, you see things that other people miss. We know which areas get cleaned properly and which ones get overlooked. We know which staff members follow protocols and which ones take shortcuts when they think nobody's watching. The meetings had resulted in several policy changes that improved both patient care and working conditions for support staff. Most significantly, we had established clear guidelines about respectful communication between all levels of hospital personnel, with consequences for violations that applied equally to everyone from department heads to entry-level employees. Dr. Thompson, who had become a genuine colleague and friend, often remarked on how much the hospital culture had improved since my arrival. It's not just about treating custodial staff better, she told me during one of our coffee breaks. It's about recognizing that good patient care requires contributions from everyone, and that respect for colleagues improves the quality of medicine we practice. She had taken my suggestions about cardiac tamponade recognition and developed a training program for residents that covered uncommon presentations of emergency conditions. The program had already prevented several diagnostic delays that could have resulted in patient deaths. Jessica Martinez had eventually returned to work after taking several weeks of personal leave following the revelation of my identity. Her approach to managing the emergency department had changed dramatically, and she now treated all staff members with professional courtesy rather than hierarchical condescension. We had never directly discussed the months of humiliation she had subjected me to, but her behavior suggested genuine remorse mixed with professional embarrassment. She worked hard to demonstrate that she had learned from the experience, and I chose to focus on her improved conduct rather than relitigating past conflicts. Dr. Chen, she said one evening as we both finished our shifts, I wanted you to know that I've been thinking a lot about the way I treated you before I knew who you were. I waited for her to continue, curious about what she wanted to say. I realized that I was using my authority over housekeeping staff to feel more important in my own job, she admitted. It was wrong, and it says something terrible about my character that I needed to learn you were a famous doctor before I started treating you with basic human decency. Her apology felt genuine, and I appreciated that she had taken responsibility for her behavior rather than making excuses or claiming ignorance. Jessica, I said, what matters isn't who I used to be, but how we treat each other going forward. You've shown real growth in how you manage your department and interact with staff. That's what counts. The most rewarding aspect of my new position was mentoring young physicians who were beginning their careers in emergency medicine. Many of them approached medicine with the same idealism and dedication that had originally motivated my own career, but they also carried pressures and expectations that sometimes led to the kind of arrogance I had observed in some of my colleagues. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a new resident who was no relation to Jessica, reminded me of myself at her age, brilliant and hardworking but occasionally impatient with people she perceived as less knowledgeable or efficient. Dr. Chen, she said after I had gently corrected her dismissive treatment of a nurse's suggestion during a patient consultation, I don't understand why we have to pretend that everyone's medical opinions are equally valid. Shouldn't expertise matter? Expertise absolutely matters, I replied. But expertise comes in different forms, and experience often teaches lessons that can't be learned from textbooks or lectures. I told her about Margaret's insights into infection control patterns, Frank's observations about patient behavioral changes, and the countless times that nurses had noticed critical details that physicians had missed. The nurse you dismissed earlier has 15 years of emergency medicine experience. I continued. She's probably seen more cardiac arrest cases than you'll encounter in your entire residency. Her suggestion about medication timing wasn't based on theoretical knowledge, but on practical experience with what actually works in real emergency situations. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. I guess I've been thinking about medicine as a hierarchy based on education rather than a collaboration based on shared goals. Medicine at its best is collaborative. I agreed. Everyone contributes different skills and perspectives, and the patient benefits when we combine all that knowledge effectively. These teaching moments reminded me why I had chosen emergency medicine originally. It wasn't just about the adrenaline of life and death situations, but about the intellectual challenge of synthesizing complex information from multiple sources to make decisions under pressure. My PTSD symptoms had continued improving as I rebuilt confidence in my ability to practice medicine safely and effectively. The unexpected loud noises that had once triggered panic attacks now caused only momentary anxiety that I could manage with breathing techniques and grounding exercises. Working in a supportive environment where colleagues understood my history and accommodated my needs had been crucial for this recovery. When helicopter ambulances approached the hospital, Dr. Thompson or other colleagues would quietly check in with me to make sure I was managing well. When trauma cases involved mass casualties that might trigger memories of Syria, I could step back from direct patient care and provide consultation support instead. The key, my therapist had explained during one of our sessions, is learning to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. Your brain learned to associate certain sounds and situations with danger, but you can retrain those responses when you feel safe and supported. The safety and support I had found at Metropolitan General had been essential for that retraining process. 1 year after starting work as a janitor, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during those early months of invisibility and humiliation. The International Society of Emergency Medicine wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference, speaking about trauma recovery and the importance of supportive workplace cultures for healthcare providers who had experienced psychological injuries. Dr. Chen, the conference organizer, explained during our phone conversation, your story represents something important about resilience and the value of diverse perspectives in medicine. We think our members would benefit greatly from hearing about your experiences. I accepted the invitation, knowing that sharing my story publicly would help other medical professionals who might be struggling with similar challenges. Standing on that conference stage 6 months later, looking out at an audience of emergency physicians from around the world, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from cleaning toilets to consulting on complex medical cases to addressing my professional peers about recovery and resilience. 2 years ago, I began my presentation. I was Dr. Sarah Chen, internationally recognized trauma surgeon. 1 year ago, I was Sarah Chen, night shift janitor. Today I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, again, but with a deeper understanding of what medicine means and who medical professionals can become when we support each other through difficulties. I told the audience about my experiences with PTSD, my decision to start over in a custodial role, and the way that supportive colleagues had made it possible for me to return to meaningful medical practice. But I also talked about what I had learned from being invisible in a hospital environment, about the perspectives and insights that became available when you stopped being seen as important by the people around you. Some of the most valuable medical knowledge I gained during my recovery came from custodial staff who noticed infection patterns, security guards who observed patient behavioral changes, and nurses who shared practical wisdom about patient care, I explained. Medicine improves when we listen to everyone who contributes to patient outcomes, not just those with impressive titles. The standing ovation that followed my presentation felt like validation not just for my personal recovery, but for the broader message about respect, collaboration, and the value of diverse perspectives in healthcare. After the conference, I returned to Metropolitan General with renewed appreciation for the community of colleagues who had supported my journey back to medicine. The hospital that had once felt like a place of exile and humiliation had become a place of belonging and purpose. Frank greeted me in the parking lot on my first day back, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing his familiar grin. "How does it feel to be a famous speaker?" he asked, settling into our usual spot near the emergency department entrance. "It feels good to be useful again," I replied. "But mostly it feels good to be home." Margaret had left a welcome back card on my desk, signed by all the custodial staff and containing a note that read, "Thank you for remembering where you came from and helping us feel valued." Dr. Thompson had scheduled a case consultation for my first afternoon back, a complex trauma involving multiple patients from an industrial accident. As we reviewed the medical reports together, I felt the familiar satisfaction of applying specialized knowledge to solve challenging problems. "Dr. Chen," she said as we finished our consultation, "I'm glad you're back. The hospital runs better when you're here." That evening, as I walked through the corridors of Metropolitan General in my consultant scrubs, I thought about the woman who had started working here as a janitor, invisible and dismissed by the very people who now valued her expertise and perspective. She had been searching for a way back to herself, to the physician she had been before trauma changed her life's trajectory. What she had found was something better, a deeper understanding of medicine as collaboration rather than hierarchy, of healing as a process that required courage from both patients and providers. The woman who had cleaned toilets while secretly being one of the world's most experienced trauma surgeons had taught everyone around her, including herself, that human worth isn't determined by job titles or other people's recognition. It's determined by your willingness to keep contributing, to keep learning, and to keep believing that you have something valuable to offer, even when the world can't see it yet. Today, I save lives in trauma bays instead of cleaning them. But I'll never forget the lessons I learned during those months when I was invisible, or the people who helped me remember that being seen clearly by others starts with seeing yourself clearly first. Sometimes the most important healing happens not when you return to who you used to be, but when you discover who you've become through surviving what tried to break you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.